So just keep that in the forefront of your mind, that the information you share in the chat box is seen by all. Looks like we have a good number of participants joining us. So I think we'll get started shortly. The room is still filling up. And I want to thank everyone for taking a little bit of time out of their day to join us for this NACAC legislative update. So we're going to get started. We are going to do a little bit of housekeeping in the beginning before we get to David and his announcements. So I would like to encourage you to use the chat box now. Use that chat box. And I would like to know a little bit about who is here today so we can mix and mingle, network. So for example, my name's Jessica Green. I am the chair of our NACAC Grac committee, our Government Relations and Advocacy Committee. So as chair, I have the responsibility of leadership. So I am Jessica Green. I'm from California. I live in California. I work at UC San Diego. I'm an admissions officer. And then let us know if you are a Grac committee member, like an active Grac committee member, or if you are a newbie. So please use that chat box now if you haven't. Okay, looks like Lauren's here with us. She is a past president of NACAC. Thanks for contributing. Ian, so good to see you. He is an active member of that Grac committee. I'm seeing a lot of faces I recognize from the Grac committee, and I'm really happy that you're all here today. So keep filling that chat box with who you are. I think it's going to give us some context. And our newbies, I'm really excited for you to be joining us. So for our agenda, we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. David's going to present, and then we're going to do a closing. All right, so I just kind of wanted to start with a little bit of like, who is NACAC? I know you're NACAC members, but sometimes I think we forget. So NACAC supports and advances the work of counseling and enrollment professionals in California and Nevada as we help all students realize their full potential with an emphasis on transitions to freshman and transfer to higher education, and attention to access and equity for all students. I am going to pop in the chat box a link to the presentation I'm sharing right now so you can get these resources. We do have a NACAC profile, which highlights our membership, our activities, as well as our strategic planning. So our vision ahead for 2025, what we'd like to see out of NACAC and our accomplishments. So who is Grac? So Grac, the Government Relations and Advocacy Committee, is a standing committee in NACAC. And we help as a committee take the NACAC membership to try to demystify the legislative process and advocate for policies that promote access and equity to education in California and Nevada. So further, who is Grac as an organizational chart kind of view? I see a lot of familiar faces on the call today. We as a committee have 3 standing subcommittees that do a lot of really great work. And a lot of people's names are listed here on the screen, but the committee itself has over 70 members. The names listed on the screen are like really active members in that subcommittee work. If you are a member of the committee, but you don't see your name listed here, I'd love to get you further involved with some of our subcommittee work. So what are the subcommittees and what do they do? As Grac, we actually have 2 lobbyists that we work with, one in California and one in Nevada, to help advance our legislative advocacy. And these subcommittees do things for the committee. So for conference subcommittee, if you'd like to get involved in our Grac conference subcommittee, we plan our legislative conferences, whether they be in person or virtual. You might enjoy coordinating hotel logistics or organizing legislative schedules, speakers, managing registrants. And if that sounds like something you want to get involved in for NACAC and the Government Relations Committee, you can reach out to Nicole Pilar. I'm going to send this separately so you'll have all these emails and contact. For communications, they manage the Grac communication strategy. So our volunteers coordinate email campaigns. They take the lead on social media, managing our membership list, and supporting the other subcommittees with communication needs. And you can reach out to Lori Calloway if you'd like to get involved. And then for our professional development and advocacy subcommittee, they might host webinars to help demystify the process, postcard writing campaigns, phone banking. So really more of like our active advocacy group. So if you want to volunteer with them, we've got really great leadership with Robin and Christina as co-chairs. So how could you get involved further after today if you want to? You can complete our Grac member survey. This is how we send notifications about our upcoming meetings, in addition to putting them in the WACAC e-blast, which is that email that you get pretty much bi-weekly with updates from WACAC. So we do have a steering committee meeting coming up tomorrow morning. If you want to register, you can register there. Again, I'll pop the link in the chat box after this. And if you want to do the steering committee, if you want to take an active role in participating in the Grac committee, but if you're not interested in taking an active role, we also have a meeting on January 22nd for just updates, information that we share with our general membership. And then, of course, we have our California Virtual Legislative Conference coming up between February 22nd and 24th. And this is an incredible opportunity where our lobbyists will give you a California one-on-one legislative briefing. We will do virtual legislative meetings, as well as we'll have a series of speakers. And if you are interested in learning more about, well, what is that conference, our communications subcommittee put together a fantastic one-sheeter that you could share with your supervisors, your leadership, to get permission to attend this free conference. So if you're interested, you can use that link and download that PDF for your use. So now we're just going to get started. David, thank you for giving me that space to talk about the Grac committee. And I want to just look at the chat really quick. So excited that we have so many people participating. It looks like we have a lot of our California membership, people from San Marcos High School, so the high school side, the college side. Thank you all for taking your time to be here today. So David is the Executive Director of Education and Content Policy. Just on the screen, he's been with NACAC for 2 decades, so like 20 years, which is so fantastic. We're really lucky, and I think he'll probably speak to a few things about himself as well. But he's really working on high-level focus for the organization, expanding our advocacy agenda, and also just making sure that we're promoting equity and inclusiveness. So thank you for being here today, David. I'm sure you'll speak a little bit more about your experiences. So take it away. Would you like to screen share?
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much, Jessica, and everyone for having me here, for giving me an opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing at NACAC. So let me pull up my presentation here. Just take me a second and put it on slideshow. There we go. Oops, I thought I clicked it. There we go. All right. Does everybody see that okay? Just a thumbs up, nod of the head. Yes, thank you. All right, thank you. I also wanted to say, if I missed someone, I apologize, but I did see Allison Tom's name in the chat there, and Allison was on our National Government Relations Committee. I always want to take a moment to thank people who serve both at the affiliate and the national level. So thank you all, of course, for caring enough to be here, and also serving for those of you who serve on the Government Relations Committee in WACAC. It's not a small thing to step out of your day-to-day job and do something. I've done a couple of things in my lifetime, like PTA president at my kids' elementary school. That's the first and last time I'll ever do that. It served on condo boards. So it's, serving and volunteering is not a small thing. And even just getting engaged in one effort that is sort of beyond the scope of your day-to-day work is really, really helpful and really important. So thank you all for being here. And thank you, Allison, for serving and sharing your expertise at the national level. Before I start into sort of the meat of the presentation, I did want to note that, as you all know, this is a time of great change and uncertainty, both for our country, but also for NACAC itself. Last year we had a change in CEO, which would be a big change for any organization, really. Angel Perez took over in July, and we've done a lot of great things, I think, since he's been here. But the COVID pandemic has complicated things a bit in that we have had to reduce capacity at NACAC. We've had to change the way we do things. A lot of the face-to-face events and activities that we used to do have really changed. So, no more traipsing around Capitol Hill for me and my staff. It's all Zoom meetings. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that last week's sort of seditious event at the Capitol was quite a wake-up call and quite a sobering event to have to live through. In fact, I was telling folks that I was actually at the NACAC office, which is across the river in Arlington, Virginia, and I heard what I thought was a motorcade, a presidential motorcade or something going by my office. It's sometimes happens when they come out into the suburbs, but instead it was police vans and buses from the Arlington Police Department headed over to help out the Capitol Police. It just puts a lot of this in perspective that we do live in a democracy. It is a fragile thing, and I think what it underscores for me, having now reflected on it for a week, is that policy advocacy is one of the most important things we do in a democracy. If we don't speak up, nobody hears us. And so the idea that we have thousands of associations, but in NACAC and WACAC, we have organizations that bring people together who care about what they do, care enough to sort of articulate the things that they need help with, the challenges that they face, and their students, and go to state or national capitals and articulate themselves. It's a really incredibly important part of our democracy, and I commend you all for being involved in it. Not to mention that what you do is so important and helps me so much on a personal level through NACAC that I extend my personal gratitude as well. So with those words out of the way, we'll go ahead and jump into what I'll talk about today. And I want to stress that this is, it is a presentation. There is a sequence to it, but by all means, throw up your hand or put up a chat. It's a little bit hard for me to see the chat when I'm in full screen view here, but if there's any burning questions, just please feel free to throw something out there. I will stop and address it right then and there. So what we'll talk about today, what is NACAC's traditional policy advocacy? For those of you who've been around, you'll recognize this sort of our framework that we've used for many years, which I think we'll continue to use in the future. But we also want to talk about how NACAC advocacy is changing. That framework has served us well, but we do also find that we advocate on an awful lot of issues, and we want to make sure we're making an impact when we do advocate. So I think as we go through these changes that I talked about earlier, we may do some refining of our priorities, and we may try to focus in more closely on some priorities. Not to mention that one of the things I'll talk about is a recent report that NACAC issued as a result of our ad hoc committee on leadership and college admission, which has given us sort of an even higher level framework to work with. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to get involved, although I suspect most of you on this call are already involved and so therefore don't need a lot of information, but I will talk a little bit about how to get information from NACAC and how to get involved at the national level if you'd like. So let's see. Why am I not advancing here? There's something. I see a chat bit here. Oh, there's a congratulations there. Thank you, first of all, for the congratulations. I did recently get promoted to the Chief Education and Policy Officer, which has happened between the last time Jessica and I spoke. So I am pleased to be able to continue the service to you all, to the NACAC members. March will be 21 years, and I'll say this, it has been an absolute pleasure and honor to serve you all. I think I tell everybody the reason I keep coming back is that the members are so great. You're such a great group of people to work for, and it just keeps me coming back day after day without questioning ever what it is I do for a living. Sleep well at night, So let me just say right off the bat, our advocacy is rooted in our core values. And I've thrown up a picture here of our guide to ethical practice in college admission. You all are probably familiar with the fact that for as long as NACAC has existed, since 1937, we have had some form of a code of ethics. Last year, we were forced by the Department of Justice to drop some of our provisions out of our code of ethics. And as an extension of that whole antitrust investigation, we ended up moving our governing assembly and our board ended up moving us from an enforceable code of ethics to now we have a code of ethics that's voluntary, that's a best practice document. So NACAC, if you hadn't already heard, NACAC is out of the business of enforcing our code of ethics. The reason I mention this right at the top is that what that does is that transfers what we used to do through enforcement to a whole new set of things. We're going to now be communicating, we're going to now have to use education and information and advocacy to make our point, where previously we might have enforced our standards. So what it does is it elevates our core values, and our core values are the bullet points you see there: commitment to education, access and equity, professionalism, collegiality, trust, and social responsibility. And I think as we go through our priorities, you'll see how those are sort of interwoven into the into the fabric of what we do. And even I think some of these core values are reflected in the fact that we advocate at all. We advocate in a way that promotes collegiality, that promotes trust. We have a very student-focused orientation at NACAC, as you know. We consider the interests of students to be primary. After all, if you don't have students, you don't have a school, right? You don't have an institution. There's no tuition revenue coming in if you're an institution. So we really have to put the students' interests first, and they are the reason why we educate. So the fact that we advocate, the fact that we go and do what we do is a symbolic really of all of these core values. Oops, I have to click in the presentation every time I want to advance. So I mentioned earlier that we had convened an ad hoc committee on the future of leadership in college admission. And their report, which is available on the NACAC website, is a more sort of association focused report. It gives some background about the demographic changes, the changes to the education landscape, but then it talks also about what NACAC as an organization needs to do. So as a government relations document, it doesn't really address government relations. What we did though, is we took some of the landscape and we took the issues that did relate to policy and we pulled them out into this report, which is called Roadmap for Change, Reimagining U.S. Higher Education as a Public Good. And that, as you can see on the left, had 6 primary sort of pillars that the ad hoc committee was really focused on. And this, I want to emphasize, this is a new thing. As you can see, September 2020, this is something that is going to guide our advocacy, whether it's policy or otherwise, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, well into the future. And it's based on feedback from our members that came through that committee, not just from the committee members, but from the members that we invited all members to submit feedback. So it's based on a broad sort of representation of member perspectives. And as you can see, we came down on the fact, again, students' interests are primary in this equation. That's kind of a bottom line for us. We also emphasize that transparency is really critical in both policy and practice. So we advocate for a lot of policies at the federal level, certainly about transparent information for students and families, about costs, about loan defaults, about all, you name it. But also institutions need to be transparent in what they are asking from students and what their policies are. The third piece is kind of the core of all of this, which is that higher education, particularly of all education, but higher education is a public good. And when we say that, what we're saying more or less directly is that, K-12 education in this country is free for anyone who wants it. They could go to public K-12 education. We think college ought to be the same way. We think it's about time that we move in that direction. And while we haven't endorsed a specific approach to the quote unquote free college movement, because there's actually no one, there's a lot of different approaches there, we do feel like a long-term goal is that public higher education should be available to people just as K-12 education is. And that's going to be a long-term goal, but it's something we're going to start working on sooner than later. We want to rectify policies that calcify or perpetuate inequities in education. And I know all of you are familiar with the fact that when you're born in America, you're born into inequity. And what we need to do is we need to, as our profession, we look at this and we see what happens as students are going through K-12 education, particularly in the latter years. But as admission officers, we see how that looks when you're making that transition to post-secondary education. We vividly see the inequities. And then of course we try to do things like, implement race-conscious admission policies, and people seem to not acknowledge that we are in fact dealing with inequities, that we can't as higher ed just treat everyone as if they've come from the exact same school and treat them all the exact same way. We need to be sure that we can calibrate our own systems to account for this inequity. We want to protect students' rights. We've, for a long time, NACAC has advocated for students' rights, but we want to make sure that we protect them from predatory institutions like for-profit colleges in many cases, protect them from predatory lending. There's just many different ways in which we get involved in those issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, fully funding public higher education. The notion that state governments have, even though they are spending more dollars on public higher education, the amount of spending per student has gradually been declining. And the State Higher Education Executives Organization do an annual report, and they basically, for most states, the commitment to public higher education in 2019, 2020 is lower than it was prior to the recession in 2008. So we need to change, and we need to get back to that. If we're ever going to realize that goal for higher education being a public good, we're going to need those state appropriations to come back up. So that's a big new feature, and that's going to be our really high level umbrella. I talk with my hands sometimes. You can see my little umbrella hands going there. That's going to be our umbrella that we're going to use to frame our policy moving forward. This next slide starts to get into kind of where we've been, and I don't imagine that this is going to change a whole lot. This is something that we've used for many years because it reflects what we see as school counselors and admission officers, right? You look at these, first of all, college access policy should be equitable. I don't know how many people would want to disagree with that. But what we've seen over the years, and this is based in research, the first point there is that there is inequitable access to high school curriculum, first and foremost. We see it. There's probably at least one or two reports a year that demonstrate how students who are positioned in the same way academically nonetheless have inequitable access to things like advanced coursework, teaching and supplies, and you name it. So in order for us to consider that we're sending students off to the college application process in a somewhat equitable fashion, we have to make sure they have equitable access to the school services and the classes that they need to make it to college. Then, of course, we look at school counseling. Yeah, you're all probably familiar with the fact that student to counselor ratios across the country are just out of hand. Some states more than others. I think California was up there near the top for a while in terms of exceeding 1,000 students per counselor, but they've actually come down over the years. I think some good hard work of WACAC and your allies there there was a state bill a number of years ago that specifically hired counselors, and I think that was pretty much responsible for California's coming off that sort of top perch or bottom, depending on which way you want to look at it. We also, so students need that kind of advising. We've seen research study after research study that shows that you can be academically prepared, you can qualify for financial aid, but if you don't have assistance in sort of navigating the process, your risk of dropping out of the pipeline increases. Which brings us to the third point, which is obviously, and this is probably the easiest point to make, which is if you can't afford it, then you're very likely to drop out of the pipeline. And that's, as we look back at our roadmap, this is kind of the crux of the issue. We keep trying to say, let's increase the Pell Grant, let's increase need-based aid at the state level, let's increase, but we still haven't really fully come to grips with the fact that we have shifted the burden of paying for college onto the backs of individual students and families. Whereas when the Higher Education Act was passed, the idea was that, particularly for students who couldn't afford it, that burden would be carried by the state, by the taxpayers. And I think it's a burden that we believe is worth carrying because education has such great benefits, not just for the individual, but for the society as well. So until we get our public sort of universal access to higher education, we're going to continue to advocate, of course, for need-based financial aid because that's the only other tool we have right now. And then finally, of course, we're supportive of DACA and the DREAM Act, particularly if we can get the DREAM Act passed, the need for DACA would be reduced, at least for the students. So that's our first major sort of bucket of policy issues. And I saw another chat come up. I'll check really quick for a question. Okay, great. I just wanted to show you this. You may have seen this already, but our research team went to U.S. Department of Education data, which is gathered from each state about student to counselor ratios. And we looked at the ratios on the district level, actually the school district level in each state. And these are obviously California and Nevada, and it's not looking great there, is it? I see some shaking heads out there. And there aren't really many states that do look good. But I think these are the kinds of tools that we try to put together to help make the case, to show sort of vividly, this is what you're dealing with here. And the red there clearly, student to counselor ratios exceed 500 to 1. We just have to do better than this. And I think that I'll talk a little bit about the Biden administration, but they've certainly pledged to double the number of what we call pupil services officers in schools, which is good news. They're not exclusively counselors, but school counselors are part of that equation. So we're hoping that at the federal level, we see an infusion of money for school counselors and others like school psychologists and school social workers. So just want to make you aware of this resource. We'll certainly share this with you all afterwards. You can use the link there to look at these and other states. Our third sort of existing, and I'm watching my clock here to make sure I don't run over Jessica. I'd like to leave time for questions or discussion, but our third priority here is protecting students. And that's again part of our traditional advocacy. And it really is all about stopping predatory behavior in the higher education space. And if you've followed NACAC at all over the last 5 to 10 years, we are one of the go-to organizations when it comes to this issue, because one of the key ingredients in the recipe for fraud and abuse at unscrupulous colleges is high pressure commissioned sales. And that's certainly not something NACAC has ever stood for, nor will we ever. But I included this. There's a little graphic on this slide that shows one of the actual pages out of a training manual from a for-profit college recruitment guide. And as you can see at the bottom, it says it's all about uncovering their pain and fears. Once they're reminded how bad things are, this will create a sense of urgency to make this change. Literally a page out of a textbook, well, sorry, I shouldn't say literally. Those words are directly from the textbook on high pressure sales. I actually went and bought a textbook on high pressure sales. And it says this exact thing about creating a sense of urgency. And really, if you think about our approach, we will throw a lot at students. We will advertise, we will court them, we will text them, we will do a lot of those things. The difference is we're really just trying to get their attention. We don't shove them through the door. We don't stuff them in a box and carry them through and then let them out on the other side. And this is where our core values come back into play, because when a student goes to an institution, they're not expecting to be swindled. Like, we might go to a used car lot and think, okay, I got to get my game on. I got to get my defensive gear and be ready for this fight that's going to happen. But nobody thinks that when they go to a school or an educational institution. And these institutions have unfortunately taken advantage of students' trust. And what results is that they have large amounts of student loan debt, little to show for it in the way of a diploma or employment prospects. And we're ending up having to pay for a lot of the student loan defaults. And of course, their credit is ruined. Their eligibility for Pell Grants and student loans is used up, so they don't get to go back to college with the assistance of the federal or state governments. So this is a particularly important thing that we've done, and I can imagine we're going to continue to do it in the foreseeable future. And then finally, I'd say that our most recently adopted priority is to support global student mobility. And this has been something that's developed relatively recently, but we just want to make sure we understand that the only way we're going to move forward in time and in progress is to be open to the rest of the world and to promote countries and students engaging with each other. I think we've seen that the last 4 years have been quite damaging for the US, particularly in global student mobility. The pandemic didn't help. But I think, we look at it not just from the US perspective, but from the international perspective, where we want to make sure that we promote this for its own good, but with also keeping in mind that institutions that are members of NACAC and high schools, I mean, there is a large number of students coming to high schools in the US and around the world, that there is an economy here, and we want to keep that economy vibrant, just as we want to keep our public diplomacy, and we want to keep the education for its own sake going. So we have a whole set of issues that we monitor there on the left that are dealing with global student mobility. Just an example, a couple of examples. The travel ban that the administration put into place that had obvious implications for international students, and not just from those countries. I mean, can you imagine being from a country and just kind of that might not be on that travel ban list, but do I really want to go to that country to study? That just doesn't. And then of course there are always visa issues, with students getting visas to the U.S. and that certainly didn't get any easier over the last 4 years either. So we're going to be doing a lot of advocacy moving forward to try to open that process up. Why don't I pause there? Jessica, I'm going to look to you. If there's any questions about our existing priorities or anything you want me to elaborate on, the rest of the presentation talks about, as you can see with this slide, what we're dealing with in the current moment. And then I have a few more slides after that about ways to get involved and things like that. But maybe I'll pause for questions here.
Yeah, it's 12:30, so we have about 30 minutes left. We did receive a question going back to the data on school counselors in the different states. So I don't know if you could backtrack to that slide. But is there any way to disaggregate that data a little bit more, to distinguish between 9 through 12 counselors and others? Or is the data source just kind of all clumping counselor ratio as kind of like one thing?
That is a great question, and I should know the answer right off the top of my head, but I will need to go back and check that. We have been very careful. The reason it's a great question is we deal with it all the time at NACAC. There is not an easy way to get secondary school student to counselor ratios because of the variation in the way secondary schools are defined across the country. But we do often do analyses with schools that include anything up to grade 12, right? So it could be a traditional 4-year high school, it could be a middle and high school, it could be just sort of a single school. I'll need to go back to refresh my memory as to whether this is K-12 ratios or whether this is just the secondary school ratios.
And Emmy, I don't know if you're available. Did I get that right, or was there some elaboration you wanted to provide?
I feel stupid unmuting myself, but no, thanks for this, David, and thanks, Jessica. And I feel stupid taking up the stage here, but thank you for doing this. It's always been interesting to me that I'm not sure if just separating it out and making K-12 would be better or worse. And so in some ways, maybe leaving it all in aggregate for K-12 it is better for making the case for more counselor ratios, but I feel like it's not. I feel like it's worse, and that on the 9-12 side, there are fewer counselors per student than when you're into kind of K-8 schools.
And you're exactly right about that, Emmy. And Emmy, I'm remiss. I did see your name earlier, and you've been on more panels than I can remember. You were on our standardized testing panel, right? Is that just this last year? Thank you for that, and thank you for that point. You are absolutely right that in the earlier years, in the elementary and middle years, the student to counselor ratios are much worse than they are in the secondary years and then high school years. But I just have to go back and see which ones, but I'll certainly circulate that to let you know which these are.
Yeah, and as David continues, I might visit the link and see if there's like a little blurb.
Yeah, do that. That's precisely what I would do.
From the research team. Are there any other questions that we'd like to address before David moves forward with some of those, with other topics? Yeah, Sonia?
Or actually just a comment. I'm also wondering, Emmy, to your point, that I spent a decade in the public school sector where I was that counselor who had 650 to 1 at one point in my career. And when I think about K through 12, we're at the mercy of how schools are identifying who the counselor is. And sometimes it's administrators that are acting and serving as counselors. They have like dual roles. So it's not really, so they check the box or whatever, but they're really not providing full counselor roles at their school. Although they might say, I'm the vice principal and counselor, so to speak.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, Sonia. And we have in our own NACAC surveys, this is federal data here. And one of the things that we see in this data is that it can vary wildly from state to state in terms of the quality of the data we get. And I think that point that you made is exactly part of the issue there. They have so many different ways of classifying counselors and numbering them, and just like get into the fact that you have schools that have fractions of counselors because they like the old judges and back in the early days of the U.S. They have counselors who kind of ride circuit between different schools in the same district. So it's really quite complicated. And I think, Jessica, that this is K-12. I would go out on a limb to say that because the national data really does break down on the K-12, is sort of K-12 classified. But again, do check me on that. So I'll continue, of course, but Jessica, if any questions come up, please let me know. Now, what you've seen is our big framework. It sort of captures everything that we normally advocate on. Maybe there's some things that slip between the cracks, but we really do have quite a broad spectrum of issues that we advocate on at any given time. Now, with a new administration coming in, there's always a lot of excitement, a lot of opportunity to get in there and make a difference. So what I thought I'd do is just, sort of make a brief rundown of the issues that we're dealing with now. And these aren't necessarily in priority order or any other order, because as you can see, COVID relief, which is in all caps, is down there at the bottom. It probably should be at the top if we're looking at this in a rank order list. But I'll just note, that right now, student loans are a big topic of conversation. NACAC has actually signed on to numerous efforts to try to get student loans forgiven, at the very least, and this is actually happening. We've had success with this, that student loan repayments be deferred until we're well clear of the pandemic. We're continuing to look at the to the new administration to extend that well beyond the current February 1st date that the Trump administration has set. Let's see, educational equity. Again, I think the Biden administration is very keen on. First of all, they're very aware of the educational equity challenges. I think the pick for the nominee for Education Secretary, Miguel Cardona from Connecticut, is someone who will focus very closely on this as Education Secretary if he is confirmed by the Senate, which we will absolutely advocate for. It's something that we're going to focus on. We think we have an opportunity to look at new ways of approaching this issue, but also sort of bolstering the funding that we provide to schools through the Title I programs that the federal government provides and other programs. So free college proposals. I mean, obviously the Biden administration talked about a free college plan. They have a proposal on the table, which is 2 years of public college for free. We know that's going to, I would say, hit a buzzsaw. That doesn't exactly, that's not exactly what I mean. It's when it gets to Congress, that will sort of, I'm trying to do this with my hands. What is probably a very solid proposal coming out of the administration's offices will get to the Hill and it'll get sort of disaggregated and blown apart, and potentially it'll come back together as some proposal. Maybe it's the same or maybe it's different. So there's just a lot of opportunity there as we look at what the administration will propose and then what Congress will do to consider it, to advocate precisely for what we talked about earlier, which is universal access to higher education for anyone who's interested in pursuing it. So that's going to be, and that'll happen actually. The second and third bullet there will be down the road a little bit. The student loan issue is going to be something that the Biden administration will have to deal with early on. I'll say that the COVID relief down at the bottom, that's another big one that they're going to have to take care of just right as soon as they get into office. I think you all probably saw the news that Congress passed a decent sized COVID relief package at the end of last year, but the amount of money that they provided was only a fraction of what K-12 and higher ed really need. So there's going to be another COVID relief bill moving in the near future. The last two that I'll talk about, again, which are a little bit longer term, the previous administration really did a lot of damage at the Department of Education. Staff, not just things like staff morale, but just dismantling programs, taking regulations off the books, and even the regulations that they did have on the books that they tried to eliminate, but then were told by courts they actually couldn't and they had to enforce, they just didn't enforce. I mean, it was, and again, I'm gonna say this from as objective of a standpoint as I can, that the administration just wasn't doing the work it was legally bound to do. So there's a lot of turmoil there that's going to have to be fixed, and we're certainly, particularly on this issue of protecting students from predatory institutions, that's going to be one area where we are very involved, because we have some pretty clear ideas about how the department should be policing and enforcing these programs so that so number one, students aren't taken advantage of, but number two, we protect taxpayer funding. We protect the money that is intended to help students get an education so that it's not siphoned off into some corporate, multi-billion-dollar cash harvesting machine. So those are issues, those 6 issues are going to be the ones that we're dealing with directly out of the gates. I linked our first 100 days proposal down at the bottom here, just because it would be a very long document to try to go through in a PowerPoint presentation. It would bore you silly. But it is hyperlinked, so you can just click right through on the presentation, and it'll take you to the full document. And again, this is really just for the first 100 days. If you want to drill down a little deeper into the issues that I've identified here, you'll see what we are asking the Biden administration to do sort of as soon as they get into place. Now, I can guarantee you that there's some issues that this administration needs to deal with before they get to anything involving education, which includes the future of democracy in America, and I wouldn't begrudge them that. So, so we know that we'll have to take these as they come. But on those lines too, I should note that particularly for the Government Relations Committee folks, NACAC usually does a legislative event in early March, which would be sort of alongside our winter leadership meeting. We have scrapped plans for the winter leadership meeting. We have decided to do the legislative thing in a more virtual format. And I think what we're going to do is move it even further. We're going to move it into April, which is when a lot of other associations have their event. But I just want to make sure we haven't announced it formally yet, but that's where it looks like we're headed. And it actually might work, because what I do see is a good month or two of needing to do some real urgent work on behalf of our democracy and getting the Biden administration in place. This is the cabinet secretaries and such approved by the Senate. So they probably won't get into real business, business that applies to us until a little later than normal. So that's where we're headed.
David, we did have a question come in the chat box. Brianna, I see you've got your camera on. Are you in a space that you want to speak verbally to ask?
Sure. Hi. First of all, David, thank you so much. This is so interesting. I live in California. I'm at an independent school in Santa Monica. But I was curious, when you were talking about all these issues, have you compiled information about Congress people who are supporting, who would be our allies going forward as we move into the spring, and like in California, but also out nationally, and like, how can we help that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. We do have information. We have a system that we keep at NACAC, and it's a wonderful system. I just sounded like Trump just then. I'm sorry. It is, but it is actually a pretty amazing system. It's sponsored by Bloomberg. It's a Bloomberg product that we use, and we are able to keep sort of diary entries on all of our members and voting records and things like that. So as we approach the April timeframe, where we're starting to gin up our advocacy pitch, we'll be sharing more information about individual members that we'd like to approach and where we can apply ourselves most effectively. Let me put it that way.
Thanks, David. We did have another question come in. We have about 15 minutes left. I kind of want to just make sure that you're getting through what you need to. Are there some additional slides? And I
do have, I think, 2 more.
2 more, okay. Christina, did you want the opportunity to speak verbally, or would you like me to ask your question?
I can just ask it really quickly. My question was, we're talking about some of these key issues. I was just wondering if mental health and support for mental health for students and staff is going to be part of it, simply because it's something that I know. I work at a university, and prospective students, it's like the number one thing they've been asking me about is, what are your resources? What is out there? And in reading the applications this year, I haven't read a single application where students haven't mentioned the lack of access to mental health resources.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christina. Thank you for asking it. It gives me an opportunity to note the issues that I have here are really the issues that are popping in the next couple of months. Like I can see them like being high on the agenda for one reason or another. Not level of importance, but just that they might be on the agenda sooner than later. What's not on here is, I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration talked about doubling the number of pupil services officers in schools, and those primarily are focused, school psychologists, school social workers, school counselors, on that mental health aspect of at least being in secondary school, or any school actually, K through 12. So we'll certainly be advocating for that alongside our partners like the American School Counselors Association and the other pupil services organizations. In fact, there's a coalition for that. As you'll see on my last slide, I put a bunch of coalitions up there. But then more generally, one of the things we may be doing in our sort of newer advocacy approach is that our current Trends and Future Issues Committee last year recommended a series of potential activities or actions pertaining to mental health, and I think that would fall into the area of advocacy in a more sort of a broader sense, but also education, training, resources, things like that. So that I can't say exactly when we'll get to it, but that's pretty high on our internal agenda as a topic to wrestle with and start producing some more resources on. So I'll go ahead, Jessica. I'll go ahead and just move through these last. Let me see if I can fast forward. Oh, there's more than two, but I'll get through them quickly. We have a number of new initiatives going on at NACAC, and I think that the biggest thing that I want to mention today is how is advocacy changing. We want to continue to focus on policy. And I mentioned earlier, we're going to sort of think strategically about what we're doing on legislative issues and make sure we have good focus on those. We did get a Lumina grant late last year, and we're going to implement it early this year to look at how we might change the admission and financial aid processes with a sole focus on racial equity as our objective. So if we had to go start all over again and redesign these systems with the only goal being racial equity, how would we do it? And what we hope is that provides us a roadmap to look at practice issues that admission officers and financial aid officers can the levers they can pull. We want to look at it from the institutional perspective. Because we all know admission officers can't just go around waving a wand and changing things. There's presidents and trustees and such involved, such untidy things as those. And then we know there's legislative issues that need to be addressed. So we want to come out of that report with a whole suite of things to advocate for. So they might be advocacy within the profession, they might be advocacy at the institutional level or at the policy level. So we're going to be very strategic about how we look at our policy initiatives moving forward. We also want to advocate for the profession itself. We want to be able to tell people this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is why it's important. And then finally, as I said earlier, we want to advocate for ethical practice. Because we can't enforce our guidelines anymore, we want to make sure that we're saying, we're talking about what is good and what is right in admission and counseling. And trying to set the standard and being vocal about it, so that even though we can't, I always likened it to the seatbelt laws. You don't see a lot of enforcement on seatbelt use. You might see it if it's a traffic stop, but you don't see like big checkpoints set up just to check your seatbelt. What you do see are billboards that say, "Hey, click it or ticket," or just an education effort. So we want to make sure that we're providing education and communication about ethics. One of the ways in which our sort of advocacy for the profession and for ethical practice takes shape is that we do a lot of work on social media and other places. But this was an example. We tweeted out, this is my Twitter handle here. We tweeted out to the Florida Board of Governors, who, as you know, is still requiring standardized tests in admission despite the pandemic. And what was interesting, we tweeted a letter that we wrote on behalf, or we signed on to with SACAC and the Accept group. And this is an example, we do this all the time. So if WACAC has issues that you want to, use the NACAC sort of imprint for, if it can be helpful to you, we're there for you. But as you can see on the tweet, there's this @SM Travis, and he's one of the head higher ed writers at the Miami Herald. And so we tweeted that out on October 8th, and you can see on October 15th, there was an article that talks about Florida and the SAT requirements that they have. Now, I'm not suggesting that we caused that article to be written. I mean, there was a lot of people talking about this issue in Florida. But what I didn't show on this slide is that this letter was referenced in that article. And so there's ways in which we want to be operating in and around the media, just in public discussion. This is how we want advocacy to look. So we encourage, all of our affiliates, if you have issues that you feel like we can help with, let us know. We're going to be there and we're going to be able to bring some resources to bear on it. Now, how can you get involved? How do you find information? Well, here's a few web links that that I'll throw up, and I'll send the PowerPoint over to Jessica after this. We have a newsroom where you can stay tuned to everything that NACAC as a whole is doing. Our advocacy letters, we post several a week actually, because there's so many floating around. You can kind of see what we're working on at the federal level. And then in general, the advocacy and ethics bar on our webpage is just full of pages where you can go and look at what NACAC has done. I think probably following the NACAC Wonk Twitter handle is one of the most up to the minute ways you can look at it, because I will tweet 3 or 4 times a day and sometimes 10 or 12 times a day, depending on what's going on, just to kind of get the NACAC word out, just to say, hey, here's this thing in the news, but here's what we think about it. And maybe sometimes here's how you can take action on it. So those are ways you can kind of stay tied into it. And certainly once we get our capacity back up to speed, Jessica, for instance, will be communicating a lot more with the affiliate chairs so that we can equip you all to do this work as well. And then finally, I'll just show you this quick slide about some of the coalitions that we're involved in. And I'll just say that pretty much each one of these coalitions and organizations that we work with in DC has local affiliates, so that, if you are looking at a specific issue, there could be 3, 4, 5, 6 other organizations working in the same space. And we're always happy to connect with our national partners to get contacts locally. And I think, again, in WACAC, you all are pretty sophisticated. You all have a lot of these relationships already. So just want to just put out a quick reminder about that if it ever comes up, that you're looking for people to work with. So I'll end it there. That's my email address. I do encourage you to email me if you have any questions. I'm always happy to connect with you all and to give you personal attention, because I do appreciate what you do. And then again, there's the Wonk handle and the little graphic they made for me. I usually do wear glasses, so it's a little more appropriate when you see the glasses there. Anyway, Jessica, I think I've left you 5-7 minutes to go. And of course, if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer those as well.
Yeah, I would invite some more questions. I'm going to, could you stop your share?
Yes, ma'am. Let me do that. There we go.
And I actually did not find at the report level, the link that you provided, it references that the data is coming from the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, but it's not referencing the, I guess, tree trunk to find how they're defining a counselor. So that would probably be of interest to us to understand how they're defining a counselor as we use that resource.
Got it. I have written my note down. You'll hear from me right after this presentation. I'll figure that out for you.
Thank you. And I'm going to put this into this mode. Hopefully y'all can see my screen now. David shared so much information with us, and I just want to kind of plug again that if you feel compelled to continue on this journey for government relations and advocacy, please participate in the WACAC opportunities that are available to you. And I do send out meeting invites to anyone who fills out the Grac member survey. So if you want to start receiving those invitations to other meetings we have in subsequent months, please fill out the Grac member survey. And I'm going to pop that link in the chat box again. But David, thank you so much. I think we're really excited about the partnership and to work with you. And I know I'm going to be reaching out for just some more building. So we have about 5 minutes left. Would anyone like to ask some additional questions? It looks like the chat, I'm seeing some thank yous. Thank you, David. We really
Thank-
appreciate you.
Yeah, well, hey, thank you all. This is such great feedback to see. I really appreciate your having me. And again, I would just reiterate, I will be happy to follow up on anything and everything that you all need, particularly with regard to advocacy and government relations.
Thank you. So I just put in the chat box again the link so that you can access the Grac survey. If you have not filled that out, please do that so we can connect you and plug you in. And then, or come to our meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And I'm gonna get that PowerPoint from you too, David. We're gonna send it out in a Google Drive with the recording, so everybody will have access to it. But thank you all. I'm so excited. There's about 40 people hung in the whole time, and you're probably hungry. So, all right. Thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully see you in subsequent meetings. A lot of familiar and kind faces. So again,